So it's my honor to speak here, and I just want to express my deepest gratitude to all of you who are working so hard to give to our library and ensure that this is a place of beauty and creativity and imagination for all of those in our community. It was not a given that I would become a writer and an illustrator. If you had met me long ago when I was a child, in fact, I think you would be incredibly surprised at what led me to becoming a writer and illustrator. And it was only through the work of libraries that I found my path. I'm often asked by parents who want to support their kids in becoming writers or artists, what should we do? What should we get them private lessons, art lessons before they go off to art school? And they ask me for all this advice, and I really don't know what to say other than take them to the library, drop them off, and let them alone. Everything they need to become an artist is at the library. I myself did not go to art school. It was a roundabout path to becoming an artist, but it was the library that brought me to it. I was born on an island off the coast of Alaska. It was an uninhabited island. My family lived there in a tent. My dad was a soil scientist, and by the nature of his work, we had to travel to remote areas that had never been mapped or civilized before. So I grew up in a very isolated location. I was not exposed to books as a child. My mom I had a twin sister, and that was my only community, was my twin and I. My mom used to have to cook our food over a fire, wash our clothes in a stream, and to do all the chores that she needed to do while living on a remote island. She would tie us to a tree, and the two of us would spend hours tied to a tree. And we would chat away in our toddler talk, and stories became a really big part of our life. My sister was a very impatient tree nester. She wanted to go off and play, and she would become very unsettled, and so I would tell her stories. And stories became a really important part, and eventually imaginary friends became a very important part of my life because I lived on an island with a twin that was having a lot of difficulty living there, and so often I would play with the friends that I created through my imagination. My dad was the kind of guy that was really focused and driven on his work, but as we got a little older, we would often accompany him on his mapping projects. But he was the kind of guy that if he was off mapping, part of his work was that he would dig these holes that were about this wide and up to 6 feet deep. And he would test all the different layers of the soil, and that was his focus. And when we would accompany him in the field, sometimes we were going through terrain that he had already been through, and he was testing how the soil drained and everything. And I would inadvertently step into a hole, and these holes were so tight that you would fall in and be pinned. Your arms would be pinned. And I learned pretty quickly that Dad was not going to realize I was stuck in a hole for a number of hours. And so again, stories became an vital part of my life, because when you're pinned in a hole up to your head, you can either panic or you can create a story. And so stories became a really rich part of my life. Eventually we moved to the mainland, and we lived in a town where there were people our own age that went to school. But by then it was actually a really rough transition for me, because I hadn't gone to school. I hadn't been surrounded with kids my own age. So I didn't speak correctly. I had to go to speech. They marched me down to speech therapy lab immediately. My sister and I didn't wear the right clothes. We didn't go to the right church. We didn't have the activities. We didn't know how to play sports. There were a lot of things that we didn't do, so we didn't fit in. And so it was quite an adjustment. This town, though it was big enough to have a school, it was not big enough to have a library. But eventually, one day, a bookmobile came to our town. It was one of those silver Aerostars. And I stepped into that Aerostar not knowing exactly what a bookmobile was, but they had books of everything. And they had a lot of how-to books. A lot of people had to be pretty crafty when you live far from town. But there was a small section of children's books. And I was 12, and so I picked up a book, Witch of Blackberry Pond, and I read it, took it home and I read it. And I loved it. I read it again and again. I read it 3 times before I had to return it. And inside those pages, I discovered the character Kit, who was like me. She was an outsider, forced to live in a strange land, and she was treated differently because of that. And this book taught me how to navigate the world. It taught me how to cope, taught me how to make sense of all of this. It gave me a companion who taught me that my differences were my strength and that I needed to learn how to fit in, but I didn't need to give up the differences. I didn't need to give up what was special about me. She taught me this. When I went back to the bookmobile and the book was due, I tried to return it and get another book, but that book meant so much to me, I checked it out again. And I read it again and again until it became part of my bloodstream. Eventually the bookmobile came back. I needed to check it in. I couldn't check it in. I checked it out again. And I lived with this book. I carried it. I put it under my cover. I thought that this book was the only book in the world that understood me. And it was my guide. And the fourth time the bookmobile came to town, I tried to check it out again, and the librarian there, who was very kind, she said, "I'm not going to let you check out this book. You have to check something else out." And she forced the book out of my hand, and she made me check another book out. And the way she did it was she said, "But I have a gift for you." And she had bought me a copy of the book to take home, which this is the book. So then I read a different book alongside of which were Blackberry Pond, and I realized there were other stories that understood me and made sense of the world. And so then I became a reader, which was the most beautiful gift anybody has ever given to me, was to allow me to become a reader. And so I began to live in the library, or at first the bookmobile, eventually our town got a very, very small library. But along that time, my sister had really gotten off the path. She wasn't a reader. She didn't have the gift of the stories. And our family had really struggled with the transition and moving to population and had by then pretty much dissolved. I was living with another family and I was young, but I was okay because I had stories in my life. And they had made such a huge difference to me. So fast forward many years later, I realized when I thought about this book, I realized that the character Kit wasn't the only force that was in this book. There was another character in this story that came to life through all these multiple readings, and that was Elizabeth herself, the writer. When I was a child, I wanted to be Kit. I knew I couldn't go back to the 1600s and live in a settlement and be tried for a witch and go on and marry a pirate and live a fantastic adventure, although I did find somebody who took me on fantastic adventures. But I realized what I wanted was to be the woman behind the story, somebody who was courageous enough and brave enough and generous enough to share her imagination with others. I wanted to be Elizabeth George Spear. I wanted to move to New England and write children's books the rest of my life. And so on one day, 15 years ago, my husband and I were talking, and I said, the only thing I want to do is write children's books. And we moved to this beautiful town, and the very first thing we did was we got a library card. And there was this beautiful children's book section. We actually got a card for the Peterborough Library and the Hancock Library because I was greedy for stories, and I needed as many as I could find. And the second gift that a library gave to me came through the Peterborough Library, because all those years I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know how to go about it. And the children's book section here was so wonderful. And Lisa, the librarian, every time I'd go, I said, "Do you have a book about this?" And she'd put the right book in my hands. And the book that she put in my hands then was Out of the Dust by Karen Hess, which was so beautifully written. I no longer wanted to let fear drive the boat. I wanted to write my own children's book. And that was 1,000 Tracings. That was my first book. I wrote that, and by the time that book came out, I had written 5 more, and now I've written 29, I think it is. And Dave quit his job to be an engineer, and we travel all over the country and talk to schools and libraries, and we talk to thousands and thousands of kids every year, hoping that to make that connection between the stories that live in their minds and the books that they're reading, and for them to understand the stories that live in their minds are the same as the stories that their books that they're reading. They come from the same place and the same heart, and try to get them to understand that all you have to do is listen to those stories and put them down on the paper. So I'm incredibly grateful for librarians and libraries and all that they can do. They really saved me as a child. And every time we support a library and keep the doors of a library a rich and safe and beautiful place, we are giving kids an opportunity for a different path in life that maybe they wouldn't be able to see themselves unless they can visualize themselves on the cover of the books. So thank you for letting me share my story with the library, and thank you for putting so much effort into supporting our library. These libraries, they really matter. So thank you.
Thank you.